At one point, I had a company that didn't want to sponsor a work visa for me, which was pretty complicated at the time in China, but was happy to have me do visa runs. And I just said, I'm just going to a different country every visa run I need to do. And they were fine with it. It costs less than the work visa.
Hey there, points people! You just heard a clip from Stefan from Rapid Travel Chai and every Passport Stamp Facebook group. Stefan has traveled to every country in the world, and he founded the leading Facebook group for country collectors. He also co founded the Extraordinary Travel Festival. In this episode, expect to hear about how to visit some of the most difficult destinations. And we're rating difficulty in terms of getting visas for those countries and also finding award availability. These destinations include Micronesia, Central Africa, the Stands, and so much more. And if you are in the market for a new card so that you can earn points and travel like Stefan, check out geobreezetravel.com/cards. And if you're not sure what card is right for you, I offer free credit card consultations at geobreezetravel.com/consultations. And if you're looking for even more strategies for how to maximize your points, sign up for our free live training by going to geobreezetravel.com/webinar. I only do these types of free live trainings every few months. Also, we don't record them. We go through tips and tricks that I don't cover anywhere else, and if you miss this free training, you miss out. So again, you can register at geobreezetravel.com/webinar. It's completely free, and I hope to see you there. And now, on with the show. Welcome to the GeoBreeze Travel Podcast, a show for anyone wanting to level up their travel hacking lifestyle. I'm your host, Julia Menez. I'm a travel hacker, coach, speaker, Filipino-American ENTJ who loves solid travel gear and using shortcuts on spreadsheets. On this show, I'm on a mission to bring you travel hackers from all walks of life to help you level up your travel hacking game. We dive into credit cards, miles, points, strategy, mindset, and the secrets behind how to travel the world for next to no cost. So let's get hacking. Hey, Stefan. Welcome to the GeoBreeze Travel Podcast.
Thank you. I listened to every episode. It's not a joke. And I love how you've added tutorials as well as the interviews. So it's an honor to be with you today.
Thank you so much. It is an honor to hear that. And I'm so excited to have you here. And I think a lot of people might not be aware you have been to every country in the world. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Is there any like weird definitions of every country or everything? Like when you were on this quest to collect every country? What's
Of
like the
course,
weird?
like any hobby or niche, there's people that are militant about their definition. The starting point for every definition is the 193 UN member states. And from there, you start getting into all kinds of debates. And I have a standard line that when you meet so-called country collectors or systematic travelers, after a drink or two, they'll say, "Can I show you my spreadsheet?" Because they've got, is it like we just had the Summer Olympics and there's why we're there, I think 206. What does that mean? What are those territories? But 193 is the common base definition. And then from there, it's a lot of geopolitics, a lot of arguing, and generally fun to go around. What I will say about many of those lists, like Traveler Century Club is a popular one, is it does provide a great travel planning resource of places you might not know in the world. I mean, the first three countries in South America that I went to were not majority Spanish or Portuguese speaking. And if you're in French Guiana looking at the US rocket launches, technically you're in a overseas department of France. It counts as France. It's very, very different than having been in Paris.
I don't think I've ever been to a bar where I've been like, let me show you my spreadsheet, and I was an actuary. All right. How did you
People,
get
yeah.
in?
I worked in property casualty insurance and I sat next to an actuary who was more interested in K-pop than spreadsheets. But yeah, like so much of this, it's what you do for your day job and then what you do passionately while you're supposed to be working or what you're doing at home. And if you've built one of these lists, you've got your reasons for why it is the list to use.
How did you get into this? Did you get into country counting or points and miles first?
It was the country stuff, and when I was very little and I'd have a birthday party, my mother would dread if somebody gave me a toy that I didn't have before because I would immediately flip it over, look at the back where they used to have all the pictures of the whole series, and I would start thinking, Do I have it all? So usually people with the every country itch, it's something like stamp collecting. There's a little bit of that. I studied Chinese in high school in Minneapolis, studied abroad in Shanghai and Hong Kong during college, and started traveling around every province in China. First, it was just whatever bus or train was long enough to sleep the night. And then I started filling in a map and going to each province. And then graduate, get some internships, a little more income, start going around Asia. And then I think it was East Timor that I reached, which at the time was not an easy or cheap place to get to, that I decided I'm going to fill in Asia and I'm going to keep going around the world.
When did the points hobby kind of start to overlap with this?
It was during this period I was living in China, starting to travel around Asia, and Central Asia at the time was somewhat complicated for visas and quite expensive cash-wise. It might be only one airline operating a route. They might charge quite a bit, and, at the time, China Southern was a member of SkyTeam with Northwest, Delta Continental. I was a Northwest flyer out of Minneapolis. I had lots of miles, and I started searching around and came across the site Flyer Talk for the first time. And there was this American English teacher based in Korea that had figured out how to work the Northwest system. That with as long as you connected under 24 hours, you could keep stringing together these international connections. And he spent an entire month, 30 days traveling essentially the entire Asia network of SkyTeam on a one-way 12,500-mile award, because it just the old website just let him keep adding connection and connection, connection, connection. I wasn't that into it, but I did find that it was 12,500 miles to Turkmenistan, and I could add a stop in Novosibirsk in Russia and come out by another country, and all of this would have been very tough with cash, very inflexible. If I don't get a visa, what do I do with the cash tickets? And so that's when I got into the miles, was these very specific trips. I wasn't looking for premium cabin at that point at all. It was, I want to get to this destination. How can I afford it, and how can I do it in a flexible way?
Was this guy and were you booking, like, many of these just at once? Like, "Alright, it's the 1st of the month, we're gonna string together 5 flights right away," or are you, like, taking a flight and you can keep amending the ticket as you're going?
In his case, he had booked the whole thing in advance, and he had just planned out a whole month, like nothing went wrong. It was just unbelievable. And he shared, I never contacted or got to know the person, but I still remember that, of just, it just opened my eyes of what was possible. And in my case, I was working full time at this point. I would have shorter breaks, and I would just an open jaw or a quick trip. At one point, I had a company that didn't want to sponsor a work visa for me, which was pretty complicated at the time in China, but was happy to have me do visa runs. And I just said, I'm just going to a different country every visa run I need to do. And they were fine with it. It cost less than the work visa. I had more constrained. And that's another thing of the points. I've never not worked full time, either for companies or now for myself. And so I've never had, the longest trip I've ever taken is 5 weeks. I exhausted myself just every day, a different flight, a connection, a train, a bus. But everything else was whenever there was a vacation I could take, a week, a long weekend. And so much of that, last minute travel, that traveling on weekends or prime times, were another area where the points could really help.
I can't believe nothing went wrong on that guy's itinerary, like, 30 days of, like, a flight a day, oh my god.
I don't know if he kept posting or survived much after that. Within Africa, which is much, much bigger than you ever realize, commuting via Ethiopian Airways, where every flight is 5 or 6 hours, I did realize very quickly that even a few days of that is is quite miserable.
Yeah, I guess that's a good segue is what are some of the hardest countries to reach if you are a points and miles traveler and you're like, I want to travel to every country in the world and I want to do as much of it as possible with points and miles? What's going to be like boss level difficult?
So the toughest regions where people, so I run a Facebook group called Every Passport Stamp. It's not typically a points one, and a lot of people are proud they don't use points. It's like their hippie mentality. But the one where everybody seems to break out the points is anywhere in the Pacific Ocean. You've got islands, distances. You don't effectively have any other transport option that's, other than cargo ships and limited airlines, high cash fares. And so you start really getting into the points there. And then around Africa, specifically West Africa, Central Africa. You also have a similar situation, very few flights. A 1 hour flight between countries might be $900, but the 8 hour flight to go back to London from the same place might be 200. You start running into these obstacles, land borders and other transport may not be as accessible. And that's where the points can really shine. It typically there aren't as many people looking for these awards, and a lot of airlines in particular are not really looking at clamping down on award redemptions in some of these markets. But you do end up with some issues. Like Avianca is a very popular Star Alliance program, and I like it. I have good things to say about it, but it's actually been quite useless to me for much of my travel because they haven't programmed in to their systems most of the airport codes I've ever needed. So even if the flight exists, you can try their call center, but that's an exercise in frustration as well. So at times, I'm pushed into using programs like I've heavily used United. It's changed quite a bit in the past few years, but say 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago and more, it was incredibly flexible. Even if the award prices might be higher for a certain trip, that they actually had the airport codes in there that they could ticket it. That's a big difference. That's different than the challenge the typical points travelers often face.
If somebody did want to go island hopping in the South Pacific, is United the way to go with the island hopper route, or what is the strategy there?
Yeah, so you've got two main tracks, almost a third. So you've got the United Island Hopper you reference is a great time. It may be the only time you ever meet happy United flight attendants and crew. It's not fancy aircraft, but it's very glamorous in terms of just the destinations, the colorful characters you meet. And this refers to there's a few different routes that change over time, but between Honolulu and Guam, you've got flights that make a bunch of stops in between those two. And they're typically served by no other airline or very few other airlines. And the award availability is generally pretty good, at least in economy class. And that's where the hopper comes in. And then on the other side of Guam, so between Guam and Philippines, you've got different routes like Palau, Yap, some incredible destinations as well. And so that's Micronesia. And those are some fantastic destinations. And in a few places, they link up to what would be Macronesia or the South Pacific, where Fiji Airways dominates. And so you're typically looking at Alaska Airlines or American Airlines and other partners as they come on board, their progress towards One World membership. And that pretty much covers South Pacific. And then the last bit that sticks a bit out of many flight networks are the French speaking territories. Like we just had the surfing for the Olympics in French Polynesia. They're not that well connected to other islands in the region. They're almost better connected to France or to places like Australia or New Zealand. And there's a few link ups like the French speaking islands, Wallis and Futuna, some great, very remote places. Wallis Island, I remember, has one ATM, and if you need the ATM from Futuna, you got to take a flight over to, to use the one ATM. So you've got some very small places, you've got big traditional places, you've got busy places like Vanuatu. But those are the three broad areas of the Pacific.
How about Africa, which you mentioned is also pretty difficult depending on where in Africa you're going because it's huge. I think a lot of people, just based off of looking on maps and how it tends to stretch out places like Canada and Russia, Africa is much larger than people expect. I think I read a trivia thing somewhere that said Greenland is the same size as the Congo. I don't know if that's true, but if it is, that's insane.
There are all these maps, I forget the exact numbers, where they start fitting other continents into Africa. So you've got giant regions and a lot of countries that have nothing to do with their neighbors or their neighbor's neighbor because it's just so big. Land borders are typically in a number of places quite arduous, even for locals. So you don't have the same interchange and you don't it's not like, say, Europe, where you have a lot of commerce and traffic between countries. You typically will have a lot of flights that often are follow paths of former colonial impacts. So you might, flying out of Cameroon, you've got good options to Paris, but not to the neighbor countries necessarily. And so if you're not wanting to constantly backtrack, you do need a fair amount of miles, and it can fall afoul of some of the routing rules. So the two broadest coverage airlines in Africa in terms of countries served. You've got Ethiopian, which has its base in Addis Ababa and then owns a subsidiary airline based in Lomé, Togo. And then you've also got Turkish Airlines. And the issue with Turkish is Istanbul would be the connecting point for a number of trips. And Istanbul on many award charts is in Europe, sometimes Middle East, depending, but it's definitely not in Africa. So you often get quirks like, say, United pricing almost double awards because it's treating it like Africa to Europe, Europe back. Heavily Star Airlines. Flying Blue is useful for things like Kenya Airways is growing and a good regional player, but you've got a lot of research to do. And pull up the Wikipedia pages for the airports, find who flies them, look for Fifth Freedom flights, which often change, but that would be a number of these airlines will fly, sometimes called milk runs or different slang, but they'll go from their home country and they'll make one or two stops along the way because they can't necessarily fill the plane just on a there and back. So there's some as short as you mentioned Congo to Kinshasa to Brazzaville. It's a 13-mile flight, but Ethiopian, when I was on it, was flying every other day. Addis to Kinshasa, drop people off, pick people up, Brazzaville back to Addis, because even though it's just a river that separates the two, it's not necessarily something that people can easily cross, even locals. So you can see some of these routes, and sometimes these little one-way ones, the Fifth Freedom indicates that the airline has the ability to sell those tickets, and that's quite common in Africa. There's not the same protectionism as you may see in some other parts of the world. So if you look for some of these and they exist, that can be another way to hop around Africa. And sometimes you need to fly the local airlines, which may not have any points partner. They may be in a portal or something where you can redeem cash for points, but generally a bit more as a continent, a more expensive region to travel. West and Central, as I said, is generally the most expensive for any kind of tourist. But North Africa, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Egypt, very affordable, wonderful countries, very well connected by air to a lot of international destinations, and far southern Africa as well. Some of the most affordable safaris in the world are South Africa and Namibia because they design the parks to be used by their nationals rather than specifically for tourism. And then East Africa, where many people are very focused on safaris, and that can be a little more expensive.
I'm still trying to wrap my head around the 13-mile flight and why
Yeah.
they can't invest in
Well,
a road.
well, it's a river, but it's just all the red tape and all of that. So the idea that people wouldn't so easily have visas and the ability to cross the river to pick up a flight there, but they just don't fill up the two. You see quirky things in the Caribbean. British Airways often does things like one time when I was in Antigua, they had a British Airways 777 that flies in from London, lands in Antigua, then flew the like 5 miles to St. Kitts, and it's a giant 777. You could book a first class award if you wanted for that like 2 minute flight. It's a quirky, interesting world out there. And the more you go to destinations that are a little different, not necessarily dangerous around the Caribbean, go to Dominica, go to Montserrat, all kinds of interesting small places that you can add on to your traditional beach vacation.
Whenever I think about regions that might be a little bit difficult to get all the countries, I think about the stands. Can you talk about the strategy for like Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and all of those? And how can somebody do those on points? Or is points not the best way to try to get those?
You can only go to countries that have Hyatts if you're a points traveler, so that's somewhat is limiting, but, there's a few Hyatts in the region. I know you specifically are not like that. Okay, so, the stands, generally, when people say that, they mean the 5 ex-Soviet republic stands, and then you might include Pakistan, Afghanistan. So Pakistan, Afghanistan live in a more separate world from the other five, in the sense that the travel access would typically be from the Middle East, the Emirates, Qatar, as well as South Asia. So India has flights to, say, for Afghanistan, that's a typical entry point, Nepal. So they're very oriented towards the South and the West for them. The five ex Soviet stands, like anybody, they typically have connections to the Middle East, but where geopolitics has made things difficult the past few years is because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Many of the European airlines, like Lufthansa, that typically served all of those countries, have either suspended service or charging an incredible amount of money for that. One of the better approaches, it's tough for awards because anything Asiana is tough for awards. but Asiana does serve several of the countries in the region. And if you can come across the Pacific, goes back to history, especially Kazakhstan has a tremendous Korean diaspora of people that willingly and unwillingly and different gradations in between were put there by Stalin in World War II in that. So you've got this ties with Korea where you can find some of these flights. But broadly speaking, and until the war is over and the situation where Russia overflights are again allowed by US and European governments, you're going to find some tough award space positioning to Asia. Like I said, South Korea is the one with the most amount of service. China has different flights. That's where you're going to look, or some of the Middle East flights. And because I am due to be in Uzbekistan for Ghana Valley for an event next May, I have noticed that a number of the major airline sites like United and Delta are just giving inscrutable errors when you even search for a place like Tashkent, Uzbekistan. And they're not explicitly saying it, but I assume it's similar to stuff that a lot of airlines did, say during the Iraq War, is they were worried about any potential sanctions or limitations, and so they just stop selling the tickets, but don't say directly. They just give errors like no award available. So I think unless it's changed in the past week, if you look at United, you will see like 0 dates for Seoul to Tashkent available for the entire year, and that's not true. If you look at Avianca Life Miles, you'll find the dates that have it. So you're probably gonna look for non-US, non-European airlines to look for the award space, and then you're looking at visas. So this is heavily dependent on your nationality. Majority of your audience will take it as US citizens. A few of the countries are just visa on arrival or visa free. Depends essentially where we have good diplomatic relations, where we have air bases and that, and then where we don't, it can still be a bit tricky. Turkmenistan of the five is generally the hardest for any nationality. Very few countries have any kind of easy access, and even getting a so called transit visa can be difficult. You can look up local operators to help assist. It's not a straightforward application, and generally people that succeed take, if they have very public social media profiles, they have to often take them offline these days, even if they've never posted a word about that country. If the authorities there reviewing your application feel you're a politically engaged person because you may be posting about your home country politics, you may very well get denied for that visa. It's a fabulous, interesting country to visit. All five are among my favorite. It's a trip that I took about 15 years ago, and very much have been looking to repeat it, but that one gets a little complicated. The other four, for the most part, and for many nationalities, are pretty feasible, but generally takes some advanced planning to get the visas. And then when you're in the countries, the costs are not that high. They're also not that low. And because they're generally very low population, you might look at arranging some transport in advance or being very flexible that public transport might not be a daily thing from one city to the other outside of very major areas. So you've got some of the best food in the world, some of the most handsome, beautiful people in the world, incredible hospitality, stunning scenery. So the five stands, if you're looking for that trip or any combination of it, absolutely go for it. And each of the five is very distinct, and within the countries, some like North Kyrgyzstan and South Kyrgyzstan, almost totally distinct ethnic groups, geography, food culture. So there's a tremendous amount to see and enjoy.
Talk a little bit more about visa issues because you mentioned some of it, like with Turkmenistan, you mentioned with the
Hmm.
social media issue where if somebody wants to visit there, they should take down all social media before trying to go through the visa because their visa people will go through all your social media
Uh,
and probably reject you if you talk about our election. If you're like, I hadn't heard of this country before, but if you post anything about our election, they won't like that. All right, good tip. What are some other visas that are a little bit difficult to get?
it does change constantly. For years, Angola was one of the hardest. Now it's quite easy. The one of the things is, what is your home passport? And that can shift a lot. Iran for many years has been very hard for US, British, and Israeli passport holders, and quite easy for many other nationalities. And other countries can be the reverse. The general starting point to think about is how do you get correct information of what you need and don't. And unfortunately, especially for somewhat popular countries like Vietnam, if you search for Vietnam visa information online, you will find many bogus websites that are either wrong or scams or overpriced agencies. And there is an actual official Vietnam e-visa website, but they don't know how to optimize for SEO, Google search, and that. So they're way like on page 5, and you would never think that this really awful looking website is the real one. So the system that many people heard about a lot during the COVID-19 pandemic, Tematic, is the system that all airlines in the world subscribe to and use for all of their information. So it is the most real time resource in the world, and it is what an airline agent will use to determine can you get on that plane or not. So you can think you have a visa on arrival, you can think you have all these different things. If you don't meet those requirements, the airline can say you're not getting on this plane, and then it differs, and that's really important to pull up because even countries' official resources can often be incorrect. For years, the when I lived in New York, the Bolivia consulate had tremendous amounts of visa requirements, police reports, all these things which are not typical to get in the US. And nowhere on the website did they bother to tell you, or just fly to La Paz and pay the fee and hand them a picture and you get your visa on arrival because they wanted the income. And so don't even necessarily trust the consulate or that website. So Tematic has the most accurate information. It's a paid service, but two main airlines reliably provide you free access to the United Airlines website and the KLM. You just go to their visa information section and pull up, and you'll just see it's a very retro looking text thing based on your passport, what you're doing coming, and it has all the requirements, health forms, all of that. So check that. If a visa on arrival exists, it's there. And that's a great starting place to find out what you need to do. Do you need an e visa? Do you need to go somewhere in person? And go from there. At least you're armed with the most accurate information.
I can attest to that Vietnam story because
Mhm.
I traveled there and I was like, "Oh, we need visas," and they're not expensive. They're like, I think less than $50 per person, but you need to remember to fill it out before you land in Vietnam. And yeah, when we got to that website, I was like, "This is a scam. We are
Mm.
giving credit card information to like hackers. This is going to be terrible." It worked out. We got to go to Vietnam. Vietnam was great, but yeah, their website it looks jankety, and a lot of the actual scam websites look more legitimate,
Yeah,
so
yeah, and
yeah.
that's, I think the actual website, like, doesn't even have the SEO title that would show up in the browser. It's just like a long string of letters that yeah, so that yeah, it shouldn't discourage anybody. If you're interested in seeing around the world, one country may be difficult, but another may be easy, and then 5 years later, it may change. If you don't have to be somewhere at this moment, you can pick and choose what's interesting, and if you have more time for more systematic travel, it's quite often the case that within a region, the neighboring countries, their consulates might be a little easier to get visas or that. Now, not always the case. Sometimes they say, like when I went to Nigeria, it was, oh, get it in Ghana. Well, I went to Ghana and they had changed to, you got to get it in your home country. But forum shopping, in a sense, like Venezuela has been very tough for most nationalities the past few years. And people have crowdsourced like this consulate here in Panama, they're a bit more flexible or they'll approve business. And this one now is that person changed, so go to this one. There's at the edges, there's a lot of resourcefulness needed, but the vast majority of the world has gotten generally easier and for a lot more nationalities than had been in the past. There's great travelers on passports in the past that would have been very limited in the countries they can visit that are often finding ways to get around the world. And if you are a non-US passport, it's commonly that if you can get a US visa, Canada visa, UK visa, that often makes it easier to get a lot of other visas because then the other country says if you're going to go immigrate, it's probably to one of those. If you pass their test, like the Caribbean, it's quite common. If you have a US visa or Canadian, I believe in many cases, they'll just let you in because they're saying you already passed all their tests. Why should we redo it?
So you mentioned it's getting easier to get a lot of these visas. Do you think it's getting easier or more difficult to get a lot of these tickets on miles for if somebody wanted to do the systematic travel thing now in 2024 versus in 2004.
It's easier in some sense. There's more self-service tools. There's some very specific geopolitical issues I mentioned before. You've got the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and you've got China's extended closure during the pandemic, which has attracted huge amounts of brokers squatting and otherwise abusing ticket availability. That's really hurt Trans-Pacific availability in particular, and that's only starting to resolve itself as more flights are coming back. Like the airlines, Japan Airlines and ANA in the past were very flexible about last-minute awards, but a lot of brokers were able to take advantage of old systems that they would have that essentially they could squat on an expensive paid refundable ticket, advertise the seat for sale, and they would know that the second they canceled that ticket, it would go back into an award bookable inventory, and then they would quick snap it up with miles. So some of these programs have very strict fraud prevention things. I lived in China for 10 years, so have some familiarity. And this is not intended to be a terrible screed against it, but it's just the reality. Like IHG has entirely separate terms and conditions for members and promotions in China because of some bad actors that have scaled and abused award programs. So Asia flights are tough. Aeroplan, Alaska Airlines, a number of airlines have very specifically throttled or otherwise restricted award redemptions to Asia. Although I was happy to see just a few weeks ago, Japan Airlines released a ton of award space, and I was able to book a ticket I needed for Narita back to Seattle. That just suddenly they released like 3 months of space. So those things are improving. The what has hurt or changed things in a broader structural sense. A lot of airlines that used to be generous of releasing partner award space have essentially stopped. So think of Delta 10, 15 years ago, they would release a fair amount of award space to partners. Now it's incredibly rare of any cabin. We're not just talking about business class. So that means there's nothing for Flying Blue to book or Korean Sky Pass in those. A lot of airlines have also made their tools supposedly consumer friendly by dumbing them down, getting rid of multi city search, getting rid of different complex redemptions around the world. Tickets are essentially a thing of the past. So a lot of these, although it sounds counterintuitive, a lot of these things that are needed to book destinations that are off the beaten track or a little different are calling the airline. It might be calling, it might be the website, it might be the app, it might be chat. You might call the airline and they'll say, "Oh, that airline's not our partner." And you say, "It's on your website right here." And they'll say, "I don't know, I've never heard of it." Or you might get a great agent who can figure it out. And there's a lot of theoretical awards. So there's a lot of online resources that will say, "Oh, Aero Mexico has a chart to book this, and this." Has the author ever booked it or found a case where they've ever so some like Binter Canaries was a Iberia partner in the Canary Islands for years, and I tried for several years, never once got an award to ever ticket, and couldn't prove that they actually existed or evidence that it did, but other times it worked beautifully. And also, and this is a broader award point, it's not one to one across alliances what award inventory an airline has. As an example, United tends to have more Lufthansa award space than some of its partners do. But then there's other airlines that United doesn't have the same space. LifeMile, and it all, when I try to ask industry people for explanations, it says it all comes down to prices that willing to pay and complex contracts. But don't assume just because you've checked one resource, say within an alliance, that they're all going to be the same. And the more the so-called dynamic pricing, the more partnerships and alliances break apart, the harder it will be to be absolutely certain does an award exist or not exist. And the more resourceful you need to be of checking multiple sources, and one may very well work, whereas another doesn't.
What are some airlines where you specifically are like, you should try the phone lines or you should not do the app because they tend to not have all the availability there? Are there any particular airlines where you're like, yeah, maybe try this route?
Part of it is, can you get through to a human? Do you have status? Do you have some of those? So I'll say something like Singapore Airlines. They keep saying they're going to have online tools and they theoretically exist, and they they essentially don't function for anything other than Singapore Airlines flights. Some of their fans will get angry at me, but realistically, like when I've tried to book Virgin Australia awards with them, the website never claimed to support those, but they would actually have agents who, after a day or two, would call back and like, we're still checking, we're still trying to figure this out. All the U.S. airlines, to a degree, if you end up with really senior agents, which can be luck of the draw, can figure out things. Air Canada has some tremendous agents. Life Miles, Avianca, I've heard different things at different times. And then a number of the other Asian programs, they can't necessarily bend the rules, but some of the rules can be so complex, like EVA Airways, that they're the only ones who can figure it out, or why something is working or why not. So sometimes it isn't even that the agent knows it can fix it for you, but can tell you what's possible or what's not. So those are a few that are in the ballpark. Chat wise, Alaska Airlines has really good chat agents. Delta has agents that continuously wreck tickets. I wouldn't recommend them. It's Turkish is one. Pretty much anything other than Turkish metal, you need to get their agents, and they're always very courteous. Maybe not always as strong. Qatar Airways is great on chat. You start using programs, and for people starting out, there's such this giant constellation of programs, essentially going to every country in the world. I did it on two programs at the time, Delta Sky Miles and United Mileage Plus. Not necessarily the two I'd recommend at the moment, but having, in that case, two programs, covered two of the major alliances, and knowing their ins and outs incredibly well to pull off stuff that the typical user is not going to see was much better than I always bookmarked, like, I'm going to learn how to use JAL or ANA. I've never booked an award on either of them with their programs, because it's just, if you spread yourself across so many programs, you're going to really have trouble. I think nowadays, if you have an option with Alaska or AA, and then pick a Star Alliance. And SkyTeam is really a basket case, but Flying Blue would be the closest to a functional program. And Delta just can't even ticket, even very simple one way tickets. Delta blocks or doesn't ticket even very simple international itineraries with partners now.
And it would probably cost like half a million Delta miles anyway?
The Delta thing, okay, I'm a lifetime platinum and I have 7 years of rollover diamond to select and several million miles. It's an offensive disaster for anything involving the US or anything last minute. So they progressively penalize tickets on partners and themselves within 60 days, depends on the partner, within 60 days, within 21, 14/7. Last minute travel is the worst. But if you're going to look for partner travel, so it does not involve a Delta Airlines flight and does not touch the US in any way, the website still allows a fair amount of ticketing and will price things some of the time at a reasonable way. So itineraries within Asia on China Airlines will typically come up, but you'll want to verify. So the essentially the way Delta's programmed right now is to keep trying to price like as if like you're taking another trip. If let's say you're going to Bangkok to Tokyo on Vietnam Airways, depending on the day of the week, it may try to push you to double connect in Vietnam. So a lot of the Vietnam flights, one day they're out of Hanoi, one day Saigon, Ho Chi Minh City. And so the other day it may say like Bangkok to Hanoi to Saigon to Tokyo. And Delta will just double the award price because of that 1 hour extra connect. But if you find the day where it's the single connect, it'll price quite reasonably. And outside of the US, not touching US routes, like if you wanted to fly from Japan to Mexico on Aeromexico, as long as Aeromexico has their nonstop that you can get on, that can work fine. But once you connect through the US or Canada, everything gets to be a huge mess.
Good tip about how to use those Delta miles is
Mhm.
like outside of the US. And and as we kind of wrap up here, you've given so many great tips throughout the episode. What would you say is your number one tip for people who are looking to level up in points and miles?
Focus on scaling, and I'm a points omnivore. I can't resist deals, but if you and like Doctor of Credit's a wonderful resource. They have like what 10 to 15 posts a day. If you essentially you could spend all your day doing every one of those deals and end up broke and have a free donut one day and 1,000 miles another day and then maybe a big bonus. The people who really succeed in miles and points on a huge way, in ways that's hard to imagine, for people that are just earning hundreds of thousands a day and true businesses in that. It's because whether a buying group or other plays that are going to be non-public typically found a way to make that work and really scale it big and just keep working it until it goes away. And that can be maybe less fun. It's more of a grind, but that's the way. So if something's working, I think the thing to think about is there a way to get one more of it or five more of it or 10 more of it? Like credit card churning is more limited now, but in the past it was submit 5 applications at once and see if you get a several of them. That's a bit limited, but do you have the ability to open multiple accounts to get the same bonus? All of these things, always think about scale and look at how you can increase the earning that way rather than hopping around needing to learn new things. And that's my big failing. I love to diddle around and learn new things and it's a leap. You have to go from the public information to drawing your own conclusions and connecting the dots on things and figuring out, oh, maybe this will work, giving it a try, willing to lose a little money on something. A lot of the gift card things and that people come up with, it's because each one has a fee and they just buy one of every one and they start experimenting and they say, okay, that cost me 100 in fees. I'm willing to risk that to see if there's a hidden gem.
Yeah, I often tell people who are in my points accelerator course, if you want to really, really strike it big, you have to be willing to lose like $10, $20, $100
Mhm.
here and there on science experiments just to figure out what works. Because if it's already made it to the larger blogs, like you can only scale it so much once it's like public stuff. But a lot of it is so regional too, where maybe your gas station at your town in Indiana lets you do some things that wouldn't be allowed at the same gas station chain in New York. So you just have to conduct those experiments if you really, really want to level up. If you're like, I just need to take one trip a year, don't run weird science experiments. You can do all of this with like a couple credit card signups a year.
Yeah, move somewhere in the US that has the lowest per capita amount of finance and IT employees and has an incredible number of gas stations, grocery stores, uh, different markets. When vanilla reloads were a huge thing, which goes way, way back. But I was by my office in New York. They were firing employees for reserving cards for people. And then I took a weekend trip to Tennessee and the store had never sold one of those cards. The rack was full. And they're like, what do we do with this? Give them all to me. I'll take them to Manhattan.
Oh gosh. All right. Good tip about scaling. And speaking of good tips, can you give a shout out to somebody else on the internet that you would recommend people follow for even more points and miles tips?
I will give a shout out to Rachel Yuen. She writes and contributes at Prince of Travel, one of the great experts on award rules, award routings. I've heard her narrate, which should be like paint dry global GC map demonstrations of award trips. And I keep wanting to get her to speak at a conference and eventually we'll make it work. But there's a lot of quiet people that aren't aren't as forward facing, but are incredibly helpful and wonderful people to get to know and learn from.
Yeah. Speaking of conferences, where can people find you?
So this year, conferences are starting to come back, and the long running Chicago Seminars Conference, October 25th to 27th. That's the oldest points conference run for charity purposes. I've been speaking for almost since the beginning. I think from the third year I was involved, and you can go to chicago-seminars.com for more information. It's also the cheapest point conference out there, and a great ethos, a Holiday Inn that everybody complains about, and that's part of the fun of it. And a lot of great speakers, yourself included. And you were very kind to introduce some new voices. So I've, over the years, different conferences and events I've planned and been involved with, always try to bring new speakers and different ones and different perspectives because this hobby is both always changing. And one of the best things I like about meeting people in this, you referenced being an actuary training and in prior vocation. And I'm almost more interested when I meet points people in what they do outside of points. Because whatever it is in life, whether work, hobby, family, they always have some optimization way that is new or interesting or blows my mind. It's a dynamic, fun group of people. So that's again October 25th to 27th, Chicago Seminars. Looking forward to seeing you in person. We haven't met since the Freddies a few years ago, so that'll be great. And more events to come, totally separate from that in 25. We'll have a New York and maybe a Vancouver, separate things to be announced very soon.
Fantastic. Thank you so much again for joining us on the show. This has been fascinating, especially for anybody who's trying to get into those different countries that are a little bit more off the beaten path and a little bit more difficult to gain access to. This will be an invaluable resource. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.